Wherever you are on your leadership voyage, it starts here.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Leadership Voyage, the podcast dedicated to your pursuit of becoming a great leader. My name is Jason Wick, and I'm excited to be back for another episode with a special guest, Carol Rossi, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a second, and eventually we'll get to that conversation. But you can reach me, Jason Wick, via email at startyourvoyage@gmail.com. You can visit the show's website at leadership.voyage. Listen to the show anywhere you find podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and so on. If you've listened before and you enjoy the show, please do me a favor. Go back to where you got this podcast, the application, the website, the player, and give a star rating to this episode or to the show itself. It would mean a lot to me and help with the mission of meeting people where they're at on their leadership voyages and helping them develop their skills. Rating the show goes a long way. Before we get into this episode, a reminder about Instacart. You can go into the show notes for this episode, look at the bottom, and there's a link to Instacart. If you click that link, you'll let Instacart know that we sent you. And all you'll do is get free delivery on your first order of $35 or more. Instacart gets you grocery delivery from your favorite stores, handpicked by a shopper, to your doorstep in as fast as 1 hour. Check it out. You have very little to lose. And if you've listened to previous episodes, you know that I myself am a customer. So as I said, today's guest is Carol Rossi. I met Carol through a previous guest, Janelle Ward, who was in season 1, episode 5. And Carol Rossi has led research teams at NerdWallet, Kelley Blue Book, and Edmunds, where she started the research function from scratch. Carol has more than 25 years of experience in user experience, which if you're not aware of what that is, you'll learn right off the bat in our discussion, including a stint as the sole researcher at GeoCities in the late 90s. For those of you who are aware of that, you'll get a kick out of that fun fact. After 14 years leading teams in-house, Carol returned to consulting in 2022, this time focused on research leadership for orgs that have or want a research function, but have no internal research leadership. Carol and I talk about what does it mean to have impactful research. We talk about the value of research. And then we get a little broader, talking about decision-making and crafting good questions, talking about bias and all kinds of details along the way. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Carol Rossi on Leadership Voyage. Okay, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Leadership Voyage. It's great to be with you all again. I am honored to be with a special guest today, Carol Rossi. Carol, it's great to see you again today. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks, Jason, for inviting me.
Awesome. Well, it's good to see you. Carol, you and I met, it might have been back in April or March or something like that, and had a nice conversation. And I think we're going to have a really nice conversation with the microphones recording today. I think people are going to find it really interesting. We're going to hit on a lot of different topics. But to kind of let everybody get a glimpse into who you are, what you do. When we spoke the first time, not only are you a user experience researcher, consultant, but you also are trained in dance. So professionally trained in tech and in dance. Maybe you could give us a little glimpse how you ended up working in the field you're currently in today.
Yeah, because those aren't necessarily related to each other.
No.
No. So, yeah, I mean, I actually, my undergraduate degree was in sociology and psych. And then I uncovered this field called human factors when I was an undergraduate, and I decided to get a master's degree in human factors. So I did that straight out of undergrad. And then I started working in tech in my 20s, and I was studying dance as a hobby. And so, ballet, modern, the things that people study. And then after a few years of working in these giant enterprise companies, I became disenchanted for actually some of the same reasons people are disenchanted with UX right now. And I decided to leave. And I thought, maybe what I want to do is teach. And I love this thing, dance. And so I decided to go back to school, get another master's degree in dance ethnology, which is an academic degree. It's kind of like anthropology of movement. And then my plan was to get a PhD in anthropology and become an academic. But while I was in grad school with the MA, I fell in love with yoga. And there were these opportunities. At that point, yoga was starting to become really popular. So there were all these opportunities to teach yoga. And I was decided I wanted to teach at community colleges. So I taught at community colleges across LA, ended up teaching at a university for many years and starting a yoga program there. And at the same time, I kind of kept the tech thing going by doing really like usability consulting for a lot of clients throughout LA because I was living in Los Angeles at the time. So that's kind of how the two fields came together. And then at some point, I decided to go back into full-time tech work. And at that point, the ethnology degree was incredibly valuable because that was a point in time in which everybody was working on personas and design thinking was popular. And so because I had been in human factors before, most of my research was in more evaluative work. So the ethnology degree, I really learned how to do field work. I learned how to think through coming up with insights based on richer and more complex data. So then I went to Kelley Blue Book, got a full-time job there, worked there for a few years, went to Edmonds, started the research team at Edmonds, stayed there a long time, went to NerdWallet. So 14 years leading research teams in-house, and then I started my consultancy last year.
Well, congratulations on starting the consultancy. And it's funny, isn't it? Because we all have our journeys, and you laid yours out there. And thank you for providing all of that context. For everyone listening, I brought it up specifically here just with Carol because I have a music background, and it was just kind of fun at the end of our initial discussion how we started talking about dance and music. And even though you said things aren't related, we know they're kind of sort of related in some ways. They all, the ebbs and flows and the way that things work. But we're going to be talking a lot about your domain today in the world of tech to make sure a few people who maybe aren't dialed into tech are kind of level set. Would you mind just going through the mundane for us of defining a few things really briefly? UX would be good, and maybe design thinking, something like that.
UX is user experience, and that's the field that's really responsible for all the things that you interact with as a user of anything. So everybody's got a smartphone, most people have some kind of a computer. The way that you interact with that device is the user experience. And then design thinking is a technique that actually, without geeking out on it too much, came out of systems thinking from human factors and other fields. But it's really thinking about human-centered design. So thinking about starting with like understanding who the user is and what they need, what their unmet needs might be, and then what kinds of offerings do you give them to meet those needs, and how do you make those offerings easy for them to use? So there's a whole process that we go through.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And hopefully everybody's is on track with us now, because we'll talk about some specific things here, Carol, about your domain of user experience research and consulting. But I think what I'm really optimistic about in our discussion is we'll start to discuss some specifics of the process and your experiences. But a lot of these elements translate into other areas for people, whether they can just take a slice out of this around questions or bias or decision making. I think there's a lot that can apply to a bunch of different folks here. So thank you for helping set us up. Okay, so your work these days primarily is to help organizations identify how research can have the maximal impact. What does that mean? What does that process look like? And then let's start to take it from there.
Yeah. So maybe what I'll do is say just a bit about what impact means for research and then go into the process. So a lot of people have different ideas about what impact means. I think everybody agrees that one very important form of impact from research is that if you do a research study where you explore something like a product, like if you're working on an iPhone app, right, you put your app in front of people and you get feedback on it kind of thing, that you want to see that any insights that you get from that research change the app in a way that gets the company more money, more engagement, whatever their goals are, and it serves the needs of the person using it. So that's the ideal. So you would see impact in terms of like the product being more popular or company making more money because people feel like they're getting what they need. So that's one type. Another type of impact is organizational, meaning within the company, that the people that are working together are seeing more value from the research, and they're starting to, like, maybe the designers are starting to go to their research colleagues and ask for more information. Oh, what do you know about this topic or that topic? I need to know something, right? That's one kind of organizational impact. Another kind of impact is operational. So more efficiency in the research process, because we don't want to do things in a way that's going to waste a lot of time or resources. We want to do things in a way that's going to be effective and get the answers we need without, too much extra work. We don't need to overwork. So that's what we mean by impact. In terms of the way that I work with companies, I start by investigating. I basically do like a little research project with the client and ask them a bunch of nosy questions, like what are their goals for research? So do they want research? Do they want to do research so they get information that helps lead to business and product strategy? So it's really, kind of leading the whole process. Do they want to inform design decisions later in product development? Like they already have something and they just want to make sure they're on the right track. Do they want to understand their core customers more deeply because they don't really know much about them, right? So those kinds of things. What are their goals? And then do they already have researchers on staff? Do they want to hire researchers? If they don't, do they have designers and product managers or engineers or other specialists doing research themselves? And if they do they want that to continue? And how's that going? Because sometimes that can go really well and other times not. So do they need help making that process better? So I ask all these nosy questions. And then if they don't actually know the answers to those questions already, because sometimes people don't know, because I start asking and they go, I never thought about that. Or if there isn't really agreement among the decision makers, the leaders that are responsible for making research happen, then we do a half day or so workshop where we do that process together. We outline their goals, we outline what they want to be doing, where they want to see it research in a year. And then we could talk about challenges that they see to that. And then we talk about what they can commit to doing in the next 3 months. So that's really the client-based engagement. I also do public workshops, and I also do some one-on-one coaching. Sometimes researchers will come to me and they'll say, I really want to get a promotion. I want to work with somebody that's not my manager, or there's some specific thing they need to work on.
No, it's great to hear all the different angles and all the different roles that you can play based on what the needs are of your clients. And, it's like you're coming into this organization and you're trying to help them find, as we've said, what do they want to accomplish with their research? How can they get the maximal impact in the variety of different ways that you outlined? And one thing, as we talked the first time, and as we've continued to collaborate here over the last few days, we've been talking about, when I think about something that happens all the time in businesses or management or whatever it might be, people are making decisions all the time. I think a lot of times we're making decisions without even really being maybe conscious of it. And what I love about what you've talked through here and what you bring to an equation is rigor, and rigor around what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What's the best way to do anything, in particular, in this case, how you're going to do your research. And so in this case, I would love to spin through a little bit around decision-making and find the ways that we can apply the rigor that you bring to your consultancy to something that others can also apply to their lives. So it's a pretty broad thing to think through, but we talked a little bit about the rational decision-making model, and I'll quickly fly down it because I want you to talk more than me, but let's fly down it real quick. So the rational decision-making model is define the problem, identify the criteria you will use to judge possible solutions, decide how important each criterion is, generate a list of possible alternatives, evaluate the alternatives, and determine the best solution. You already talked a little bit about like how you might work with someone in an organization if they were to consult you and, kind of overview in the big picture. But let's dive in a little more deeply here, I would say, into some of the specifics here of maybe decision making. Now, one thing you pointed out is this six-step model is nice, but for anyone thinking about making decisions and taking this six-step model, you suggested that there's something that's usually missing in our decision making that follows all of this. And I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about what that is when people tend to neglect after they end up making decisions.
Yeah, and it's something that's come up already, right? I really like this model, and we don't have anything in here about measuring the impact of the solution that we came up with, right? And so I think that why are we making decisions? We're making decisions because we want to have some impact as a result of that decision. So if we don't ever go back and say what was the impact of that decision, then how do we know if it was a good decision? We might go through this process and check off the boxes. I've gone through these steps, but like, how do we know whether that worked? And then that can, of course, inform the next time we go through, oh, this thing worked and that didn't. So maybe the next time we make a decision, we need to think about X, Y, or Z. I think that one of the things that we seem to find ourselves, one of the situation we seem to find ourselves in right now in user experience research is that, and this is debatable, there's a very hot debate right now about how we got to the place that we are in the industry in terms of like potentially seeing disproportionate number of layoffs over the last year impacting UX research relative to engineering, product, even design. And there's one thought that perhaps we haven't measured or articulated the impact as well as we could. And that's why I'm on this very passionate campaign to be talking about this and helping people think about making sure they're doing the research that's really going to have impact. And I think the other thing inherent in decision making about research, and it's so obvious, but I think we can geek out on the research itself and be really excited about talking about doing the research. But the reason we're doing it is so people can make good decisions. And so we don't want research to just be an academic exercise where we're just trying to get to, like I was talking to someone the other day who outlined it really well. She said, in academia, we're looking for truth and we're looking to further understanding in the field, and in industry, we're looking to make decisions. And I think it can be challenging sometimes to not remember that.
Can you quickly give us a little more depth on that? I find that a really insightful comment.
Yeah, I think that the way that I think about it, and the way this person said it to me, that makes a ton of sense to me. In academia, we're looking for ultimate truth, and we're looking to further understanding within a field. And in industry, we're looking at decision making. We're doing research in order to make good decisions. And so we constantly have to be thinking, what is the decision that we're trying to make? What are we going to do with this information once we have it? Rather than, I'm going to publish this so my peers can comment on it and we can, debate, and they can add their research and we can look at it, as an exercise on its own.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that distinction. Last season, I spoke with Janelle Ward, who I believe that's how we met.
I know her. Yeah.
In the first place. But yeah, I mean, she specialized in helping people make the transition between academia and industries, as you're calling out. And I think it's really some light bulbs are going off for me. I mean, it's stuff I knew, but I didn't really think about so clearly. Thank you for calling out that kind of the distinction. Now, one thing I find interesting when it comes to decision making, kind of going through this process we're talking through, the sources of information from academia, they must be valuable, right? In helping us kind of identify the validity of options or understanding a situation, perhaps?
Totally. I think that the ideal situation is that we look at what we're trying to uncover with research. What is the goal? What's the thing we need to know? And then what do we already know about that? And so we don't want to just jump in and say, okay, designer has a question about X, or we need to uncover a new offering because we want to do something other than what we've been doing. And We don't just jump in and go, okay, let's just start doing research before we go, what do we already know about that? And what do we already know could come from academic studies. It could come from, if we're lucky enough to have a behavioral science or a data science team that's doing that kind of work. It could come from market research. It could come from analytics. It could come from customer support. It could come from anywhere. So I think we want to then parse out the validity and the value that each of those sources brings. And we don't want to just go on corporate lore, or opinion, but we want to, if there is an opinion or there is this story that we've been telling ourselves, what's that about? Is that an assumption, or is it based on some facts? Is it based on data that came from somewhere? So I think, to me, academic research is another source, just like the sources that we might see in the company, or like white papers and, public studies that we can call on.
No, I love that, where you're identifying the different sources of information we have. We've got academic studies, our own data. You also said corporate lore, which I find interesting too. I want to ask you a little bit about bias. I think fits in well here. When people are presented with a situation where they have a problem to solve or an opportunity to create, or however you want to think about that, and we're identifying criteria and options and assessing the validity of information and doing all of this stuff, what part can bias play in that scenario?
It's such an important topic, and it's something that we don't talk about enough. Okay. So I think there are a couple of things. One, I think that there's the kind of organizational challenge that a lot of us have faced, and I think it's called HIPPO. I'm forgetting the acronym, but it's the highest paid person. Yeah. Exactly. So it's the VP of such and such says this is a truth, and people run with it. And maybe that came from some research that was done somewhere, but I think we sometimes don't question those things. And so, or the sales team is telling us that the biggest clients need X, and so we should just do X for everybody, right? And so we're certainly not going to put ourselves in a position to annoy the biggest client. And at the same time, does that mean we really need to do X, or does that mean there's a problem they're trying to solve and there are many ways to solve it, and X is one of them? And so and there could be a way that we can solve it for them that can also solve it for other people, So I think there's a level of clicking in and asking a few questions to get at where's that really coming from? So that's one way to think about mitigating bias. Another thing that I think about a lot is that design is tangible, right? You can see whether something flows from one page to the next in terms of a flow. You can see whether the button is visible. You can see if the pixels line up. Those are all tangible things. Code is tangible. It works or it doesn't, The final product that you're coming up with is tangible. Even if it's software, you can see it and interact with it. So our partners that work in design, in engineering, and in product management, they're responsible for creating something that's tangible. The challenge with research is that the insights are intangible. You can't see them. You can interact with customers and you can get input and you can hear them tell stories, but the insights themselves are not as tangible. So it's not as easy to see if insights are tainted by bias. And it's really easy for people to inadvertently introduce bias into a study. And they may not even be thinking, I'm doing a study. They might be thinking, I'm having a conversation with a customer. And then, but when you're having that conversation, if you're not really prepared and you're not really engaging in a way that's going to get at the goal, if you're asking leading questions or questions that don't address the objectives, if you let your assumptions based on what this VP said or whatever, color your interpretation. There are all these things. If you're not talking to the right people that are really the target people for that, audience, the audience for that product, it's just all these things can inadvertently introduce bias. And then you don't really know that you have a biased result, and you make decisions based on that biased result. It's challenging. And this is a reason why researchers our feathers get kind of fluffed up
Okay.
when we hear, oh, people are doing their own research and they don't really have guidance, right? So, and I'm a big proponent of designers and product managers getting in front of customers. And I've seen it work really well, where I've done a lot of training and coaching, and people know the difference between when it's appropriate and great and important for them to have those frontline conversations, and when to partner with a researcher to do some of the heavier lifting. So I just think bias is one of the reasons that it's really important for us to explore these things a little bit more deeply. And I also want to talk about rigor for 1 second, since you mentioned that word. I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and what I would say to my NerdWallet team a lot, was scrappy, not crappy. Like, we want to do things in a way that's like as lean as possible, because we don't want to overdo it, but we can have this conversation and think through these things kind of quickly. And we may not need to do a big study. We might be able to do a really small study, or we might be able to just go back and look at what we already know and not do fresh research at all. So I think that's when we start thinking about prioritization. What I think about is, when do we need to do the bigger thing? When do we need to do the smaller thing? And when do we need to go back to the team and say, actually, we don't need to do any research on that, but here's what we already know, ABC, you should be able to get started with that information.
If I'm hearing you correctly in this last bit about, yes, rigor of course is good, but rigor in a vacuum, perhaps we need to be situationally aware, context driven with how we apply the right method to the right situation, I suppose, right?
Yeah, totally. And we need to have business acumen,
right,
at a level that I think we not necessarily, I don't know that we necessarily have had that level of business acumen for historical reasons. Like, so fun fact, I was the sole researcher at GeoCities for a while. And when I say that, there are people who go, oh, I had a GeoCities website when I was 8 or whatever. Yeah, I was doing research there. So, but that was the very early days of the internet, right? And so people hadn't really figured out how to monetize it yet. Advertising was starting to come up, but there was a lot of trial and error and just sort of figuring things out in terms of how we were going to monetize. Then, we went down this path of design thinking, like we talked about earlier, user-centered design. That became sort of a main approach. And then we have these other things that are sort of tech geeky, like agile and lean, and that we don't need to get into. But there are all these attempts to like figure out, how are we going to make this a viable business? So now we're at a point where, guess what? It's like 25 years in or more into the internet as a business, and we know how to make it. Companies know how to make it a viable business. And so now we need to have a really high level of business acumen as researchers. So we're not coming in and saying, let's do more studies. We're coming in and saying, let's answer your questions, business people, so we can figure out how to make the business successful by giving the users what they need. It's not one or the other.
And as you already said, I mean, you're using this research, whoever you is, you're using this research to make good decisions, right? For the business that hopefully have positive impacts on organization, users' experience, and so on. Gosh, you said so much good stuff in the bias section. I'm torn right now between going back and forging ahead. I think I do want to go back just for a second. We're trying to make a decision. We're either strategically for a product or just as an individual in a situation that we might be facing in our work. You outlined some of the impacts or maybe caveats of bias where, like you said, I think it was Hippo, highest paid person opinion. I think it is. Yes, I'll have to look that up to make sure. How we're swayed by that, the power dynamic in the organization already tells us, we don't want to disrupt the VP. So we just kind of go that way, path of least resistance, or a high value client or whatever that might be, we can over optimize for them. So part of the thing you said early on in the process you follow is getting nosy with nosy questions. And I'm kind of curious if there's a relationship here that we can help others with, reducing bias, getting the right information, whatever it means,
Mhm.
How do we craft a good question? I know that can be answered
Mhm.
in so many different ways, but I would love your take, Carol. How can someone listening out there, what can they go about, what steps to craft good questions?
I think the first thing is to go in with a sense of curiosity and a learning mindset. And because we can craft a perfect question, but if we're not open to what the answer really is, then that's not going to help, right? So I think the first thing is go in with a sense of curiosity and a learning mindset. And then the next thing is go back to the goal. What are we trying to learn? And what's the best way to learn that? And so if what we're trying to learn is what are the unmet needs of our customer, target customer, right? What are the things that they can't necessarily tell you? Because I just read this yesterday. Somebody posted something on LinkedIn that said, we don't need to do customer research because people can't tell you what they want. Yeah, they can't tell you what they want. That's why we need to watch them. So sometimes when we go in and we look at our goal and we go, our goal is to uncover unmet needs. Maybe we don't ask them questions. Maybe we observe what they're doing, or we ask them what they're doing and we ask them how they're solving for it now. And we see where the holes are, right? So I think one way to think about crafting questions is maybe it's not even a question, maybe it's an observation. And so
Huh.
if we go in with a sense of curiosity and then we go in with a goal, what's the thing we're trying to uncover? And then we figure out how to get to the right question. Often when we talk about good questions, we talk about good questions being open-ended, non-leading questions. So for example, if I have a product that I'm trying to get feedback on, I might ask people like, how might you learn about retirement planning on this financial app? Click on that button and tell me what you see. Or what's the purpose of this page might be another kind of open-ended question, as opposed to, do you see that this page is trying to tell you about retirement planning? You know what I mean? It's like,
Yep.
and that's where we start introducing bias by the way we're asking the question. Inadvertently, because we don't realize, if I say, do you realize that this page is trying to tell you about retirement planning? I'm not aware necessarily that that's a leading question and that I'm like putting this thought into the person's head. I'm priming them, so to speak.
Well, and what I kind of love too is you kind of just gave me a dose of medicine already, because my question my question was, how do you craft a good question? But what I actually really love about what you just said was, well, yes, there are practices on how to craft good questions, but sometimes it's not even the question. I think you were saying it's really, how do you procure the best information? And that
Mhm.
doesn't always involve asking the question like you're just saying. And I actually just kind of love that you're like, well, okay, the answer to your question is this, but sometimes the question isn't even necessarily the best way to get the information. You bring up observations and whatnot. But if you're going to ask the question, open-ended, try not to be leading, et cetera, all good practices.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that comes up a lot when I'm helping people, learn how to do research for themselves is like, what about follow up? Like they want to follow up and they don't know what to do, right? And there's this classic kind of, tell me more about that,
Okay.
which is like a therapist question.
It is.
Yeah, it's totally a therapist question. And it works really, really well in user experience research too, because if somebody's, staring at the phone and they say, well, I think for retirement planning, I would do this or that. And then you are the person doing the research and you're like, that's not really what I'm looking for. But, if you ask, tell me more about that, right? They'll go on. And so I think that's a thing. The other thing that I always advise people on is that if you see someone squinting or like making a face or they go, ew, like there are things that you want to follow up on. And that's oh, I noticed your expression changed. Tell me more about that.
No, that's great. Thanks for adding that on. And also just what I really loved, you opened up the answer to my initial question about asking good questions by saying it's just also really important that you have the right mindset to hear the answer, or in this case, be open to 3D listening or 360-degree listening, or however people want to characterize that, global listening, so that you're also watching, you're paying attention
Yeah.
to the non-verbal pieces as well. I love that element to add on to it.
Yeah, the quick recap, I think, is listen, observe, and if you don't know what to say, either just maybe don't say anything and wait and see what happens, or you can always do the tell me more about that thing.
Thank you. Great tips, Carol. Really appreciate that. No others can apply that probably right today to a lot of situations for everybody. The question I ask everybody at the conclusion of every episode is, what is something that you've learned recently?
You know, some people have a uniform because they don't want to have to think about what they wear
Oh, sure.
every day. So there was the black turtleneck thing. I don't do that, but I eat the same breakfast during the week because I don't want to have to think about breakfast, and I need protein and I need grain and blah, blah, blah. So I've been making this granola forever, and I just finally got tired of the same granola after I don't know how long. So I found a new granola recipe and I'm very excited about it. So
cool.
I've learned how to make a different kind of granola.
That's very cool. I love it.
It's a very California answer too.
That does sound like a California answer, which I love. I am wondering if you can try to get close to the answer. For about how long do you think you were eating that same breakfast?
Well, I've been in San Francisco 5 years, and I'm not sure I changed the recipe. During the weekends, you mix it up, right?
Okay,
during the week, yeah. There are like maybe one or two alternatives that come in, but it's probably been
That's great.
A little bit of time.
I love it.
Pretty funny.
Take Carol's advice. Get your same breakfast every weekday. It frees up all this brain power.
Exactly.
Right? No decision fatigue in the morning. You hit the ground running. Don't have to think about what to make. I love it.
And you're not hangry when you start your first meeting.
And you're not hangry when you start your first meeting. Well, Carol, it's been my pleasure to talk to you today. For those who are interested in the services you offer, want to learn more about some of the courses that you have, just learn more about you individually, where would we like to direct them?
Yeah, they can look for me on LinkedIn or at my website, which is just my name, carolrossi.com.
Perfect. And all that will be in the show notes for people to check out. Carol, great to talk to you today. Thank you so much for being generous with your time, and have a good rest of your day. I appreciate it.
You too. Thanks so much. It's been really fun.
Right, there you have it, my conversation with Carol Rossi. I enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. It's always fun to talk to someone in a very specific field like user experience research and to learn a little bit more about something if you're not familiar, dive into the area if you are familiar, and to have some broad general advice that we can take moving forward in any part of our lives. So, as a reminder, you can reach me, Jason Wick, at startyourvoyage@gmail.com. Visit the show's website at leadership.voyage. Please rate and review the podcast if you have a couple of minutes. I would really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. And I'd love to hear from you or connect with you on LinkedIn. Jason Allen Wick is the username. Search Jason Wick. You should find me. So here is today's episode recap with Carol Rossi. First of all, we talked about impactful research. Impactful research provides insights that change business outcomes. It serves the needs of a customer, it leads organizational culture change, or it adds operational efficiency to the research process. What's the value of research? Well, Carol was talking about how she had the mantra, scrappy, not crappy. We want rigorous approaches to the research, but to be smart and situationally aware in its application. That researchers need to have business acumen. They need to help make the business successful by giving customers what they need. In tech, researchers have faced a disproportionate number of layoffs compared to product management, engineering, and others. And she kind of suggested researchers have maybe not done a great job of highlighting the value of research. Research is meant to inform good decisions. She highlighted this idea that in academia, they're looking for ultimate truth. And in industry, they're trying to get to good decisions. That's the value of research in those settings. We talked about decision making. What's usually missing is a measurement of the impact of your decisions. Evaluating decisions informs future decisions and decision-making processes. Really ask, what's the thing we need to know? What do we already know about that? And then identify the different sources of information that we have. While making decisions, bias is something to look out for. We talked about HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. We talked about over-optimizing for a single high-value client's needs. You can ask questions to mitigate bias. It's hard to see if insights are tainted and biased sometimes. People unintentionally introduce bias by asking leading questions, carrying assumptions, and talking to the wrong people. Decisions are often based on biased information. What's something we can do to combat that? Craft good questions. And this topic, of course, transcends research. But crafting good questions. Go in with a learning mindset and a sense of curiosity. Stay focused on what are we trying to learn and what's the best way to learn it. A good practice is to ask open-ended questions, non-leading questions. But as we talked about in bias, we can introduce bias inadvertently by how we ask a question. When you stumble upon or hear something or see something interesting, tell me more is a powerful question. Sometimes you might not need a question at all. Maybe the power is in observing what someone is doing, and you can get insights from that. But listen, observe, and wait and see. So there's your episode recap. Thank you for listening today. Everybody, until next time, take care.